Welcome to the Majlis. I'm Adnan Husain, your host today and director of Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project at Queen's University. If you listened to our previous episode of the Majlis earlier this week, you are familiar with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism and the numerous illustrative examples it includes that involve criticism of the State of Israel. We had a wide-ranging discussion with Aziza Kanji, a legal academic and journalist, Mo Al-Qasim, a Palestine solidarity activist, and Corey Balsam, director of Independent Jewish Voices. I encourage you to listen to or watch that episode that surveyed concerns that activists and citizens have about the IHRA definition and its codification into Ontario human rights law through Bill 168. We did survey some of the examples already of external campaigns to pressure universities to censor scholars who work and discuss publicly these issues. Faisal Baba, for example, of Osgood Law School, who participated in a debate on the IHRA definition, and Valentina Azarova, who appears to have been denied a position at the University of Toronto Law School as director of the International Human Rights Program. In fact, since recording the last episode, the Ford government has circumvented democratic processes and passed Bill 168 just 2 days ago by an order in council that bypassed the scheduled Justice Committee sessions for public testimony and a possible third reading before the legislature. In light of this follow-up episode will look more closely at the concerning implications of the IHRA definition and the passage of Bill 168 specifically for scholarly research and teaching, academic freedom, and political advocacy and discussion on campus. To engage in this conversation, we have a distinguished panel joining me today. Dorit Naaman is Alliance Atlantis professor in the Department of Film and Media. She's both a filmmaker and a scholar. One of her recent works, Jerusalem, We Are Here, is an interactive documentary that digitally layers the Palestinian past onto the Israeli present of southern Jerusalem. Dorit, welcome to the program. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
We also have Ariel Salzmann, who is Associate Professor of Ottoman and World History in the Department of History. She is author of Tocqueville in the Ottoman Empire and also organized recently a conference in February called Becoming Allies that was on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism that received a lot of pushback broadly from the community. Ariel, thanks for being on the program.
Thanks for inviting me and for organizing this.
My pleasure. We also finally have Sharry Aiken, who is Associate Professor at Queen's Law School and is an expert on immigration and refugee law and teaches courses on international human rights law. In addition to being a former president of the Canadian Council for Refugees, a former editor-in-chief of the journal Refuge, she is co-chair of the board of directors of the Canadian Centre for International Justice. And she also organized a conference about Israel-Palestine that was a collaborative effort between Queen's and York University in 2007 that was Shirk funded and that also received quite a lot of controversial attack for the program. Perhaps we'll hear a little bit about these experiences today. But I'd like to start actually. Sharry, thanks so much for being on the program.
Delighted to be here.
So it's great to have you and our other two guests today. But I'd like to start with Dorit. The 7 of the 11 examples provided in the IHRA definition mention criticism of Israel or Israel in some fashion, some way or another. So it's pulled into the definition. As someone with research and film projects in Israel, perhaps you can put this into some sort of larger context for listeners about how the Israeli public and Israeli scholars and what the politics of this are from that vantage point.
Thank you, Adnan. So as an Israeli and a Canadian working and in areas that highlight the Palestinian past, present, and future in the area that is now called Israel. I have obvious high stakes and personal stakes, but also intellectual and academic freedom stakes in this debate. So I want to start by saying that the definition that the Ford government just unilaterally and undemocratically adopted a couple of days ago was drafted as a working definition by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is a non-governmental organization. Many countries sit on it, including Canada. But the organization is devoted to education, research, and remembrance. Education, research, and remembrance. And I think it's very important to keep that in context when we talk about a definition that is meant to help and originally track activities that may or may not be classified as anti-Semitic in Europe, in a European context, quite different than North American context. But when it comes to be adopted as a law, and I think that Sharry will talk a little bit more about that. I will only mention one thing in relationship to that. Talking about the problem of conflation of anti-Semitism with state criticism. So that this definition, the IHRA definition, claims that any criticism of Zionism is also, or the state of Israel is also, should be considered anti-Semitic. And that is the majority of the criticism of this definition comes because of that conflation. So instead of using my own words, what I'd like to do is read you a very short statement that was drafted by 35 Israeli historians in 2018. And I will just read it because I think it speaks exactly to the issues, and it has been written by historians, which I am not. So this is from November 27th, 2018, and I can put in the chat later the link. In the context of its EU presidency, the Austrian government will hold a high-level conference on November 21st titled Europe Beyond Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism, Securing Jewish Life in Europe. We fully embrace and support the EU's uncompromising fight against anti-Semitism. The rise of anti-Semitism worries us. As we know from history, it has often signaled future disasters to all mankind. The rise of anti-Semitism constitutes a real threat and should be a major concern in contemporary European politics. However, the EU also stands for human rights and has to protect them as forcefully as it fights anti-Semitism. This fight against anti-Semitism should not be instrumentalized to suppress legitimate criticism of Israel's occupation and severe violations of Palestinian human rights. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was to address the conference in Austria until he canceled to stabilize his government. He has worked hard to conflate criticism of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism. To our great concern, we see this conflation also in the official announcement of the conference by the Austrian government. It says, and I quote, "Very often anti-Semitism is expressed through exaggerated and disproportionate criticism of the state of Israel," end quote. These words echo anti-Semitism definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Several examples of contemporary anti-Semitism attached to this definition relate to harsh critiques of Israel. As a result, the definition can be dangerously instrumentalized to afford Israel immunity against criticism for grave and widespread violations of human rights and international law. Criticism which is considered legitimate when directed to other countries. This has a chilling effect on any critique of Israel. Moreover, the conference announcement identifies anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. However, this is important, Zionism, like all other modern Jewish movements in the 20th century, was harshly opposed by many Jews, as well as by non-Jews who were not anti-Semitic. Many victims of the Holocaust opposed Zionism. On the other hand, many anti-Semites supported Zionism and still do. It is nonsensical and inappropriate to identify anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. We must also not forget that the State of Israel has been an occupying power for more than 50 years. Millions of Palestinians under occupation lack basic rights, freedom, and dignity. As the Israeli occupation is now transforming into annexation, it is essential more than ever that Europe rejects efforts to restrict free speech and to silence criticism of Israel on the false ground of equating it with anti-Semitism. Europe also needs to do so for the credibility and effectiveness of its fight against anti-Semitism. Extending this fight to protect the state of Israel from criticism feeds misconceptions that Jews equal Israel and are thus responsible for what Israel does. As Israeli scholars, most of whom research and teach Jewish history, we say to Europe, relentlessly fight anti-Semitism to protect Jewish life in Europe and allow it to thrive. Do so while maintaining a clear distinction between criticism of the state of Israel, harsh as it may be, and anti-Semitism. Don't mix anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and preserve free speech for those who reject the Israeli occupation and insist that it ends. So that is the end of the statement, and I will share the link that it was published after the fact in Mondoweiss and a few other places with the 35 names. I also wanted to flag that the person who drafted the IHRA definition, Kenneth Stern, was a lawyer and now at Bard College. He himself expressed grave concerns about turning this definition into law. And he said, I'm only going to quote a very small portion. My fear is if we similarly enshrine this definition into law, outside groups will try and suppress, rather than answer, political speech they don't like. The academy, Jewish students, and faculty teaching about Jewish issues will all suffer. So I will stop here. Later, if there are questions, I can talk a little bit more about what this means for research done by Israelis and about Israel.
Oh, thanks so much, Dorit. That would be really helpful. A very interesting statement also there. Thank you for reminding us that that the panelists have agreed to take questions at the end. So if you just put them into the Facebook chat, we'll make sure to pose them to the panelists for later in the discussion. Ariel, as somebody who teaches on the Middle East and is a scholar of early modern and modern Middle Eastern history, how do you see this insistence on the IHRA definition as a standard and as a legal standard may affect teaching and research by scholars and specialists of the Middle East and even beyond?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is critical for, all these issues are critical for our students, faculty, administration at Queens, but none more so than actually teaching. Because, we're supposed to inform our students about critical issues in the world today. And I would argue that teaching Middle Eastern history is perhaps one of the most difficult tasks before us. And that's not only because the region is constantly changing, they're constant flux. So you're constantly updating syllabuses, changing the focus to capture different dynamics, having a very long period to cover conflicts that stretch from the Afghani-Pakistan border, to North Africa and what was the Spanish Sahara, the Sahrawiya. So you have this whole range of things to discuss, but also because your students walk into the classroom politicized and with a lot of disinformation that they get from the media that prejudices them against the very subject you're trying to discuss, against Muslims, against, thinking about the region as ever being a region where there was peace, it's like this was always a roiling region of conflict, which is so false. And because they're politicized on the issue vis-a-vis, popular culture, perhaps their churches, perhaps their synagogues, and their student organizations. So it begins with being a very difficult course to teach. And yet, as an Ottoman historian, I really don't have to teach the course, but I feel it is so necessary for students to have a grasp of one of the most dangerous conflicts in the world, one that has led to nearly brink of nuclear warfare between the superpowers during the Cold War, is at the center of energy conflicts and energy pricing. And of course, over the last 20 years, not so much in Palestine itself, but in the surrounding areas, as these wars metastasize, thanks to aggression from outside, primarily the United States, UK, Canada has been involved as well. We are facing this period of endless war, 20 years of war. So, this is a very difficult subject to teach to begin with. So what you have to do in the beginning, when I'm trying to teach, is clarify terms and clarify ideas about nationalism and the way that people conceptualize nationalism. And in the first instance, the way that this definition confounds that and further adds to confusion is not only does it never mention the Palestinians. Palestinians don't exist. So 70 years of Israeli history is not included, Jewish history, if you will. But it confounds the notion of who is a Jew. And Professor Naaman, mentioned some of this in the declarations and statements she was talking about. 54% of people who are counted as Jews by various surveys do not live in Israel. And I would argue that many of the people who are counted, as Israelis in Israel actually live outside or hold dual passports. So we're talking about, a project that was conceived, a Jewish national project that was rejected by many, was accepted by some, which is still highly contested among Jews the world over, and which, has actually a very flagging appeal to young Jews in the areas of the world which have the second and third largest Jewish population: United States, Canada, France, and UK. So we're talking about a definition that in many ways is a recruitment message, is a statement of an aspirational statement that it's making on behalf, I believe, of the organizations who are instrumentalizing and pushing this as a legislative agenda, as a way to censor, but also to coerce Jews and non-Jews into this equivalency. So, from the very beginning, this confounds the way we look at nationalism, the way we look at Jewish identity, the way we look at history. Okay, so having said that, what were we to do if this, became legislation and we were prohibited from talking about the actual causes of what has now proven to be a century-long conflict, which erases the Palestinians, which erases any form of Israeli culpability in the current conflicts? Well, you probably have to cut out about half of most textbooks. There would have to be a sort of Texas committee in Ontario that would vet our textbooks to make sure that there's nothing even remotely objectionable by any particular group, right? So we'd have these completely censured textbooks that do not in any way prepare students for the real world, for international organizations, for everything. Some of the most important crises and problems the world faces today. So that, that's a very real possibility, given the way this has uncritically, unscientifically, unacademically been disseminated throughout legislatures, and is trying to piggyback on human rights legislation, anti-discrimination legislation. So it has a very insidious effect on all of these issues. But of course, bringing it back to the classroom, I don't have a textbook. Find me a textbook I could use that doesn't ascribe particular blame to the Zionist movement and to the early, the militias that organized and created the state of Israel in dispossessing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, whose dispossession and exile has influenced the conflicts for much of the 20th century, second half of the 20th century. And the last thing I'd like to mention is that the other danger of this is that we're providing in organized groups who have already surveyed, attacked, and this is also violently attacked, academics throughout North America and Europe. We're providing them with a new tool. They already have this very extensive surveillance network in place that is targeting people who teach the Middle East, teach anything about the Middle East, and dare to, in any way, cite the actual causes of the conflicts that exist today. So they sit in the classroom, they record lectures, they post names and allegations against them. They organize responses, whether it is reporting people to the administration, saying they're anti-Semitic because they're discussing these issues. But they already have this surveillance system in place. And this surveillance system, of course, runs through organizations that are on campus and organizations that are off campus, on which are piggybacked many right-wing organizations with other sorts of agendas, and funding. And this creates, an intolerable situation in the classroom. Students are surveying students or teachers. They're surveying one another. They're reporting back to entities outside of campus. They're organizing sometimes disruptive actions within the classroom. So to bring it full circle, you've got one of the most difficult courses to teach, just purely from an intellectual standpoint, an academic standpoint, because of the constant flux, because of the range and the degree of politicization and disinformation that exists outside. Added to that, now you have this instrument that's going to be used by already well-armed and heavily funded organizations that have been out since, as long as I remember, as long as I have been in the profession, to disrupt the teaching and study of this area, and particularly the study of the situation of the Palestinians, the crimes committed against the Palestinians, and the causes, and and the solutions for this long-term conflict, which is of global concern. And I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Ariel, and please do put your questions, comments in the Facebook chat. I'm so glad that you mentioned that this is part of a long-term problem. It's not something that is new. We've already discussed a few of the most recent examples happening here in Ontario. But what is new, of course, is that this is a new instrument where in the past, maybe, upon surveilling academics and trying to establish a campaign, they would have to make the argument that it was anti-Semitism. Now they're being, potentially armed without having to make the argument by this the legal force of this. So that's very concerning. So it's actually to the legal dimensions of this that I'd like to turn and to ask Sharry, about as someone who's familiar with the human rights law and legislation, how do you assess this new definition adopted into Ontario human rights law and processes? Isn't anti-Semitism already covered along with other forms of racism and prejudice in Ontario?
Indeed, Adnan, you've really hit the nail on the head here. I think to answer your question, I want to step back a minute and say that what's going on here is part of a much bigger trajectory of parliamentarians attempting to address very real problems by throwing the law at them, when in fact, law is not the solution, right? If we look at the immediate aftermath of 9/11, for example, countries all over the world were scurrying away to develop new legal tools to combat international terrorism. And the question I really posed at the time was, there's no question we need to be worried about international terrorism, but is developing new legal tools really the answer? Would new legal tools have actually prevented or done anything to preclude what happened on 9/11? And the answer categorically has to be no. And I really draw a parallel here, right? There is a role for law and good legal tools in combating anti-Semitism and racism. But throwing Bill 168 into the mix is not going to address the problem we're all worried about, namely addressing the really real threat of rising anti-Semitism in North America and elsewhere, right? So real problem, how do you resolve it? Not with more legal tools. So that's my starting point. I want to also speak about the very real legal tools we have that may be under deployed, under resourced. There's when we look at a problem and we say, well, law's not really doing what we need it to do. The answer isn't to necessarily make new laws; it's to ensure the laws we have are actually deployed appropriately. So, at the federal level, it's a criminal offense to willfully promote hatred against any identifiable group, otherwise known as hate speech. It's embedded in the Criminal Code of Canada. The maximum penalty is imprisonment of not more than 2 years. That's for hate speech. And of course, there are hate crimes, which engage a far different series of potential punishments. At a provincial level across this country, there are provincial non-discrimination legal tools. The Ontario Human Rights Code has within it embedded anti-discrimination provisions relating to creed, as they called it when it was first enacted, anti-discrimination provisions, which are broadly framed to incorporate any activities in relation to anti-Semitism. So my point here really is to take off from your question that started it off. We have existing legal tools to deal with the very real problem. What was ever in the mind of the Ford government to implement Bill 168 as a quote unquote interpretation tool? It does nothing to aid in the interpretation of the existing tools we have. It does everything to obfuscate the interpretation, right? It's important for our listeners to understand that no rights are absolute. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's academic freedom at all costs. Academic freedom gives way where hate begins, right? But we already have a rich jurisprudence in this country and elsewhere weighing the conflicting values within a very appropriate legal paradigm. Bill 168, as both Ariel and Dorit have effectively pointed out, is not going to help in that project. It's going to undermine that project. And that's my biggest concern here. So that's by way of opening. I'll summarize by just saying criticism of any government, of any state, needs to be fundamentally part of what we do as researchers, as scholars, as teachers. I teach international human rights law. I'm regularly criticizing every single government under the sun, including my own here in Canada. I think, for example, I've used the term Canada is an apartheid state here to describe Canada's long-term and ongoing oppression of Indigenous populations in this country. I may opt to use similar terminology in relation to Israel's treatment of Palestinians. And that, in my view, is what the core of academic freedom is about: to challenge accepted wisdoms, to push the boundaries of civil dialogue, and to encourage our students to think critically. Bill 168 serves to undermine all those principles that are at the heart of academic freedom.
Thanks so much, Sharry, for those observations. Each of you have alluded to some experiences in the course of your research and teaching, that there is a history in some sense that is longer than the present moment that we're dealing with in light of this bill, of campaigns of various sorts to intimidate or to censor academic and scholarly discussion of these issues, I was wondering, some of the concerns that you've expressed. Some people may feel this is very theoretical, very conceptual. Sure, there's always the possibility that some people will be, far on one extreme and respond in ways that aren't helpful. But this is a kind of vain sort of concern that academics are having. Um, so maybe it's worth actually mentioning, at least in some specific, you don't have to give lots of details, but at least characterize that this isn't something that is just a sort of theoretical, prospective anticipation, but that in fact, actually, you have had experiences that do deeply concern you about, that will be only enhanced or sharpened by the passage of Bill 168. Dorit, you had a project that I mentioned, Jerusalem, We Are Here. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that project and the response to it.
Yeah, certainly. So Jerusalem, We're Here is an interactive documentary that digitally and virtually brings Palestinians back to an area of Jerusalem, southern Jerusalem, which was Palestinian until 1948. And so a lot of the discussion about Israel and Palestine focuses on post 67. I mean, in the statement I read, we talked about 50 years of occupation. And there isn't a lot of discussion about what happened in 1948. And in fact, in the Israeli discourse and in world Jewish discourse, it's not that easy to talk about the expulsion of the Palestinian in 1948, because if we start acknowledging that and we come up against the question of the right of return, and which for Palestinians is both a collective right and a personal right. And if Palestinians are able to return to Israel and become full citizens, we will have a state that is no longer, that may be democratic, but is no longer Jewish or no longer majority Jewish. And, with some historical justification, perhaps, and a lot of fear, most Israelis and most Jews think that if it's not going to be a Jewish majority in Israel, Jews will not be able to exist there. So bringing it up into a public space is a tricky thing to do. And because under this new law, criticizing Israel as an apartheid state or pointing out that Palestinians should have equal rights outside, both inside the 48 borders and the 67 borders, that there should be a right of return, all of these things will be automatically equated with calling for the end of Israel and thus be classified as anti-Semitic. So even having a conversation about what historically happened, as Ariel Salzmann pointed out, and then from there about how the narratives are completely incompatible, what we need to understand about the historical and political narratives in order to be able to move forward, will actually be impossible under this law. So what's interesting about Jerusalem, We're Here is that the response in Israel, the project is available in English and Arabic, because I thought that in Hebrew it will only preach to the converted. And I was really wrong. And the responses in Israel, in every screening I had, we even had 3 houses in the neighborhood, 3 former Palestinian homes that opened their doors. We installed for 3 days. We had hundreds of people come in, not the converted. People were right-wing who wanted to know who owned the house they live in, who had a story to tell, who were trying to come to terms with that. The response was overwhelmingly positive and with a lot of curiosity. And to me, what was interesting is that there was a sense that this is an elephant in the room that we have no language to talk about. When I present the project in North America, one of the first questions that I'm asked is, were you harassed? Were you threatened in Israel? Were you attacked? And so the expectation, because we don't have the same kind of possibility to have a dialogue even before Bill 168, the expectation is that the Israeli public is extremely right-wing and extremely uneducated and extremely unwilling to open up these questions. So there is already a gap. And I want to just close this by saying that, Trump has green-lighted the annexation of the West Bank in chunks. Israel is not moving too fast. But once they do it, and I think it's an eventual, I think it's going to happen eventually. Once Israel annexes the West Bank, they will have a problem of a lot of Palestinians that don't have a legal status, don't have citizenship, which means it's an apartheid state, or they will have to give citizenship, which again will end the Jewish character of Israel. So to even have a discussion about what Canada should do, should it oppose the annexation? Should it support the annexation? Should it support the annexation if it means that Palestinians get equal rights? We won't be able to do that, or will be legally penalized. And I just want to second something that Sharry said, that to me, what worries me most is that I think that Trump unleashed the ability of white supremacists to be completely out in the open with Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and other forms of hatred. And my very, very deep worry is that Bill 168 will actually turn the attention towards criticism of Israel and will drop the ball on what is home ground anti-Semitism and white supremacy. And that's what we need to fight in Canada very, very actively. Thank you.
Thanks, Dorit. I think that is a similar parallel point that was raised in the previous episode of the podcast, the Majlis, about the IHRA, about the broader political consequences of ignoring the real sources that we're confronting at present in Canada, in North America, in Europe, of anti-Semitism and its connection with other forms of racial and religious bigotry. These do seem to be connected, and this bill, by highlighting anti-Semitism alone and exclusively and connecting it so closely with criticism of Israel, really does take the focus away. So that's a very important point you mentioned.
Can I add one more thing, and maybe Ariel can expand on that? But I think that in the history of Jews in the Middle East, there was no anti-Semitism in the way that it emerged in Europe. So even when there were troubled relationships, which was much, much less than in Europe, there were no pogroms. There were not the same kind of legal restrictions on people owning land or having certain jobs or living in certain cities as Europe had until well into the 18th century, 19th century even. So the problem starts in a way with Zionism coming in and starting a national project in Palestine. So I think we also need to make room for that trajectory, which is not just historical and political, but the language that kind of glosses over historical anti-Semitism, which I think a lot of the white supremacy that comes up now is very similar and draws from that. And not only criticism of Israel, but troubled relationship between Muslims and Jews in the Middle East as a result of the state of Israel's existence, and not just existence, but continued disenfranchisement and expulsion and infringement on Palestinian rights, which continue to this day.
Indeed. Ariel, maybe you could follow up.
No, I'd like to follow up because I think, again, one of the things you have to disentangle when you're teaching modern Middle East is that the Arabs, the Persians, the Iranians, the Turks did not cause the Holocaust, because there's this way in which it's very useful in this sort of sleight of hand to move blame for anti-Semitism, and certainly the virulent, genocidal type of anti-Semitism that was experienced in Europe during World War II, to move to offshore it and to put it on the backs of other people, or to just change the subject that way. I mean, there's a very close connection, obviously, between the Holocaust and the formation of the State of Israel. And I frequently argue that there would be no State of Israel were it not for a genocide within Europe, and the consequences before, during, and after. So there's a very clear thing. But did Middle Easterners have any part of that? No. What was the Middle East like before the advent of a Jewish national project in Palestine, which holds arguably the third most holy city for the Muslim world? It was a very different place. And so for centuries, it was not a binary of Jews and Christians or Jews and Muslims. It was many different types of Christians, several different groups of Jews, and then regionalized with different languages, living with mainly the security of an Islamic state that afforded them what could be called civic rights, which included rights to property, rights to redress in terms of law, rights to their own community, and community laws, and respect for persons. So, all of this existed. And as a plug for perhaps a future episode that Majlis might have on a recent book that just came out by a colleague of mine, Elizabeth Thompson, called How the West Stole Democracy from the Arabs. What we find is not only is there's a series of constitutions produced in the Middle East that are contemporary or anticipate similar developments in the West, constitutions that grant equal rights to all citizens, regardless of their religious background. But at the very end of World War I, when Versailles was divvying up the Middle East and turning it into colonies of the West, there was a meeting in Damascus that yielded a multi-religious constitution under a constitutional monarchy. And this is the book that I just mentioned. It just recently came out. And Professor Thompson has actually tracked down that constitution and tracked down the smoking gun in the French archive, which said, destroy that constitution immediately. Let it never see the light of day, because it granted equal citizenship rights to Muslims and non-Muslims. And the broker of that constitution in this parliament that formed in Damascus was none other than the person who would be the future head of, or the future founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Rashid Ridda. And it was because of his disillusionment, because of the way the West treated this enormous effort to create, yet another very, very generous, all-embracing constitutional framework for governance, that he despaired of anything coming out of the region that would be accepted by the West, and changed his strategy from that point onward. So, we get this distortion, where did human rights come from? Where did multiculturalism come from? No, it wasn't there in the West. It wasn't there in the West. And Jews were only enfranchised gradually over the course of the 19th century. And in the case of Russia, not until the Bolshevik Revolution. So we have this completely distorted notion about which part of the world was more embracing of multi-religious rights and supportive of the security of those populations. It's completely, misplaced.
Well, Ariel, your remarks really highlight how difficult it's going to be to teach modern Middle Eastern history with all the richness and complexities if we have this kind of political interference and intervention that's trying to control the narrative and the conceptual underpinnings for how we understand big topics like nationalism, like colonialism, and their consequences and effects on the Middle East today. So I think that's very important points that you raised there. You also gave a great plug we will indeed be having Elizabeth Thompson talk about her book, um, How the West Stole Democracy from the Arabs, on November 20th. So look forward to that. But let me turn to Sharry to talk maybe a little bit more about how this bill was pushed through. I think one of the interesting dimensions of this is that this didn't go through the normal democratic processes. It didn't go through the committee and then come to the legislature for a vote, but was, an act by the
Cabinet.
by the cabinet under the Ford government. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or comments about that, why they took this approach, and what do you think the consequences are of such a step?
It's highly anti-democratic. Certainly at any level, provincial or federal cabinets do have the authority to pass orders in council and do so regularly about all sorts of things. But what's irregular in this instance is that the bill was being studied before the committee. The democratic process had been engaged, and this government sought to bypass that process. So it's very troubling. And regardless of your views about Bill 168, anybody who cares passionately about democracy should be worried about this move. I would just note that it's of a piece with a move that was announced recently by this very same provincial government to kind of bypass regular accreditation procedures in relation to a private evangelical college in this province, the accreditation of a private evangelical college, despite the premier's disavowal that he had done anything irregular. They're very similar kinds of moves, and very worrisome. If I may, I might also tag on, because one of your questions was, how is this order in council going to impact us as teachers, scholars, researchers? And you mentioned my involvement in a conference. So this was a number of years ago now, but I think it's very relevant in terms of why we're all upset. So this conference was called Israel-Palestine: Mapping Models of Statehood and Paths to Peace. And the animating objective was to bring together scholars and activists along a whole spectrum of ideas about solutions for the intractable problems of Israel and Palestine. We sought to bring together Zionists and anti-Zionists and people who didn't identify as any kind of Zionist to talk about what's the best way forward to ensure the rights of the Jewish inhabitants of Israel and the Palestinian inhabitants of Palestine. Is it one state? Is it two states? Is it no state? I mean, essentially, we had a very open-ended agenda, but the animating thread was to bring people together to engage in civil dialogue about this really important topic. And even in the absence of Bill 168, we experienced huge threats to our capacity to carry out this conference, whether it was, an intervention by the Minister of Science and Technology directly to the Shirk Granting Council to require a pre-conference review of our conference plans, an intervention that's pretty much unheard of and was unheard of at the time. To actually being asked by the administration of York University mere weeks before the conference was to be staged, that we should pay for private security in order to continue with this conference because it was too much of a threat to security. And of course, we didn't have funding for private security. So that looked like that was going to be a threat. We were able to circumvent it. But it's just to say that the mere fact that the conference took place was, I guess, against all odds at the time, more than a decade ago. In the context of what we're now facing in Ontario, I fear this conference wouldn't even get off the ground, because very clearly on the agenda was a conversation about how can we reimagine Israel-Palestine, right? So we are actually questioning the very underpinnings of the creation of the Jewish state. And that's a dialogue we should be not only permitted to hold in the context of the academy. We need to be encouraged to hold, right? We need to be encouraged to think about our future together. And that's what this conference really was all about. So I would worry that anybody who undertook a similar initiative today in on the new Ontario would be under severe threat and not be able to carry it out. I will say personally that even in the absence of Bill 168, my experience organizing that conference was deeply traumatizing and directly chilled any subsequent scholarly output that I may have had from the conference itself. I received hate mail. I received a lot of, like nothing that worried me in terms of my physical integrity, but certainly some very concerning communications from many different sectors here in Canada. And all I can say is that I was very relieved that I was granted tenure shortly before this conference actually happened, because had I not been, I think there would have been some very serious repercussions for me. So I'll just leave it there.
Thanks. I'm wondering, Ariel, if you had a follow-up.
Just very short. To all of this, I think, what's the message beyond, what's the importance beyond the academy? I mean, it's very clear. As Julie, as Sharry has been mentioning, and Dorit, we have to have these discussions in the academy to promote, parallel track, basically political movements that can't, and political engagement that can't happen other places. But more than that, I mean, what we're really talking about when we're facing these kind of insidious ways of inserting a political agenda into our human rights record is that we're influencing not only domestic policy, but our international policy, Canada's international policy, and Canada's role as potentially a peacemaker, or not simply as an adjunct to US aggression in the region. So this undermines the credibility of Canada overall, and its ability through its institutions and funding and diplomats and citizens to work toward peace in the region, and not to show up as, already, clearly partisan to one agenda. So I think that's where we take it from the campus. And in teaching and in Dorit's work, we are producing citizens who are aware and who are going to hopefully vote for the type of governments that pursue peaceful agendas.
Dorit, you had a follow-up too.
Yeah, I just I wanted to say that in my years of doing this work, I've been called many names and many things. And so being described as a self-hating Jew, as the three presenters here are and have been, or as an anti-Semitic Jew, is probably not the worst of what I've been called of or accused of. I just think that it should be really on the forefront of anyone hearing this to ask the question, what does it mean? What is anti-Semitism mean actually, if what it comes down to is stifling the kind of speech that and research and work that we're doing here? So I would turn that question on its head. And I do have a question for Sharry, which I've been wondering about in the past couple of days, and I think it's come up in the chat too. What can the Ontario legislative do about this fact that the cabinet has sort of hijacked the process, and are there ways that this can still be reverted? And yeah.
I think there are ways, and I think first and foremost, I would urge political action. We've seen the Ford government sometimes backtrack, whether it's sex ed curriculum in the context of the Ontario education program, or a whole range of other issues. Concerted community activism can make a difference. And I think that's where we need to put our focus first. In other words, expressing to the government very loudly two key themes. You've hijacked the democratic process, and by the way, we don't support Bill 168 on its merits. So both those messages need to get out loud and clear. Certainly, over the medium to longer term, legal challenges can be raised against these instruments. And, you know, they have a chance of success, but the problem with legal challenges is that they're expensive, time consuming, and slow. And so that's why I would say my first reaction would be a political one, not a legal one.
Yeah, that's come up in various ways in the chat about whether the way it was passed opens up any opportunities for challenging it politically, procedurally, and so on. So that's very helpful to know. There are also some questions about what we can do in the academic environment and the academic context, since this bill really does affect academic freedom, research, teaching in very obvious ways, as has been detailed so effectively by you on the panel. And I guess I would just say on that is that there is a petition that is circulating here at Queen's. I think there are petitions elsewhere. It's worth communicating with your faculty association that has the responsibility to guard conditions of work. And academic freedom as a serious value to the mission of education. So both your faculty associations, your student unions for graduate students, undergraduate students, you're going to potentially be receiving a very altered education when it comes to understanding this region, important political issues, if this bill restricts the ability to really articulate and express you know, the situation and to argue effectively about the merits of you know, this bill. So turn to faculty associations, your organizations on campus, and of course also your university administration should know about these concerns. I would say that it also goes beyond the university, as others have mentioned. So people should discuss these issues in their labor unions, their civic associations, and in interfaith gatherings and so forth in the community. But perhaps others have some other suggestions as well. And in the meantime, I do want to say also that a great resource is ijvcanada.org, where there are a number of petitions and ongoing information that you can use to respond to this. And also, I'd recommend people looking to Canadians for Peace and Justice in the Middle East as another good web resource on this. But does anyone have any other suggestions for people?
Yeah, I think that anyone who has tenure should teach difficult knowledge, not just Israel-Palestine, but really this is, I mean, it starts here. And next it will be about not criticizing China because we have big trade agreements. And the next thing is we can't do anything about pipelines and indigenous people because there's an economic interest. So I think that this is our responsibility. This is our privilege to have tenure and to find ways to include difficult conversations. I wouldn't recommend doing it when we're teaching remotely. I think that it's actually counterproductive when you can't be in the classroom and work through the difficulties and take the journey together with students about why we use terms like apartheid to describe Canada or Israel. You can't just drop it in and expect the work to happen. These are complex and painful conversations, and they have to be done with care. But I don't think that it should be left just to those who are deemed experts in the field. And the attempts to classify anyone who teaches Israel-Palestine, especially if they're not Jewish and not an expert in the field, as anti-Semite is, students will be quick, the outside organizations will be quick. But when we have tenure, we have some security to do some of this work. So I think the burden is really on all of us in our classrooms and outside in conversations with others.
Well, I want to really thank you, Ariel Salzmann, Dorit Naaman, and Sharry Aiken for a really thorough and inspiring discussion about what's at stake for all of us with Bill 168. And I encourage everyone who's listening to take action in the spheres you can. And also share this video for people who might be interested in the topic. Both episode 2 and 3 deal with this, and I think you will get a very thorough background on the issues. So I encourage you to share it, subscribe, rate, and review, and look out for future episodes on issues of contemporary interest related to the Middle East, Islamic world, Muslim diasporic communities, and also for lectures. Dr. Salzmann did mention that we do expect Elizabeth Thompson to talk about her new and interesting book about democracy in the Middle East and a historical episode. There'll be other activities like that, so do stay connected. Again, thanks so much for being on this panel.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.